So, I mean, the summary that I can best give for this whole thing is it's a shit show. It's a shit show of how not to run a journal. Few of you may recall 2 years ago, I talked about it on this channel and talked about it with Lee when he visited on Side Chat Saturday, amongst others. What has become known as the Fiedler on the Roof fiasco, so named for the now former editor-in-chief of the Perspectives in Psychological Sciences, which is a major psychological science, rather, which is a major psychology journal. And it was so named that because, man, was it a dumpster fire. When events happened, watching from the outside, for me, I can only imagine what was going on. And so there's been an update to that happened this past week, and I think it was worth it to come back to it, to recap some of the things, to point out some of the other things. Now, I will give a lot of credit to Lee because he has documented this in depth on his Unsafe Science Substack, which I suggest you go there and look for that. I will provide links in the description for a bunch of the relevant articles in terms of timing and events and what have you. But this post here, Notes from a Witch Hunt, has the basic timeline approximate going on here. And it all starts with a 2020 paper. And in 2022, Klaus Fiedler became the editor-in-chief of Psychological Science. The Association for Psychological Science celebrated his appointment with, support for intellectual pluralism, scientific rigor, international diversification. And so that was the support there. Spring of 2022, Bernard Hommel submits a commentary critical of the Roberts et al. Article 2020. Fiedler sends it out for review. Lee, in full disclosure, was one of the reviewers. Fiedler accepts Hommel's paper for publication, ultimately after receiving reviews, and requests commentaries from 3 other folks, including Lee. Spring, summer, and fall of 2022, with the exact sequence of events, we're not sure, but Fiedler invites the original author to reply. He provides a reply. Fiedler requests input on the reply. And the role is not completely clear to Lee on that one, but Fiedler gives the first author here, Roberts, a conditional acceptance, and asks Roberts here to remove a section that Fiedler described as an unfair characterization of Lee's commentary, specifically, in all of this. And so I'm going to recap most of this and provide the update. I'm not going to necessarily weigh in too much on this, but we shall see what's going on here. Roberts characterized his commentary as drawing on 19th century tropes, and claimed, that Lee was making a very racist remark, as it were. Fiedler asked, but explicitly does not require, Roberts to remove the section. Let's see. Fiedler expresses his view that section is a misrepresentation, and that Fiedler was trying to prevent that. Roberts ultimately pulled his paper in for publication, his paper from consideration for publication in protest of what he claims was unfair treatment. And his claims, of course, you can see. With that, I'm trying to recap this really, really quickly is one problem, because it's a long, bloody story at this point. Roberts posts his reply with an introduction, and that was what kicked off all sorts of things with a petition letter asking for Fiedler's head. So December 5th, 2022, there's a second letter that goes out asking questions about the demands in the original denunciation letter, which was kicked off by Roberts' public posts on things, without discussing the events with Fiedler, and while investigating whether or not the story that was posted online is the whole story, and without verifying the exchanges between Roberts and Fiedler that Roberts posted were complete. APS issued an ultimatum to Fiedler, resign or be fired. December 6th, Fiedler resigned. December 9th, the German Psychological Society issued an uprating of the Association of Psychological Sciences for violating procedural justice in execution of an order to summarily dismiss Fiedler. December 15th, 2022, the Association of Psychological Science issued this explanation. December 20th, 2022, the entire set of associate editors of the journal resigned, and I will say, to date, they have not filled it. And so there was a lot of social media outrage, and since then, there's been a lot of back and forth here with this. There were justifications sent out, and early in 2023, the American, the Association of Psychological Sciences sent an email attempting to justify the whole thing that they, for their firing of him, and Klaus Fiedler responded to that here. And so I think Lee actually has a good, yes, here it is. Deconstructing APS's inadequate explanations for firing Klaus Fiedler, case of unidentified flying harms and errors. Start here to get the big picture. Oh, there we go. That's probably even better. Yep, that's the kind of thing. That's the kind of thing. This is a very long, complicated saga thus far, but you can find a lot of summary stuff, and I will include that for you. I encourage you to go through it. Lee has done a great job of cataloging everything, so I won't go too much into it, but the actual letter here that, so APS is a kangaroo court, excerpts from the 126 APS letter with my commentary. Now, I will say these are experts, and I have not read the full letter. Here. Full email was sent to all APS members explaining how APS made their decision to oust Fiedler is presented here. So this is actually the full letter with it in here, and Lee goes through some of the excerpts along with his commentary. Dear APS member, in recent weeks we heard concerns from many individuals about the editorial practices at Perspectives on Psychological Science. We learned about additional questionable editorial decisions and practices at the journal under the previous editor-in-chief, Klaus Fiedler. And, of course, Lee is commenting, yeah, I mean, like what? What was the problem? Then we're going to get to that in a minute. Some people are concerned that APS took... the actions APS took were too quick to have been made with adequate deliberation and consideration of evidence. Although quick, this action was not taken lightly. No content. After the initial complaint was brought to APS's attention, journal staff immediately gathered relevant materials for the APS leadership to review. The review was conducted over the weekend following the complaint. Much of the evidence considered was immediately available via the records kept in the journal's online submission portal. The staff and leadership also consulted with the Publications Committee and heard from some editors of other APS journals. Well, what did they hear? Lee has a very good point. What did they hear? There's no transparency actually in this letter. And you can see that here. This is so short. This is so short. This is updated. We previously provided information about the editorial actions that prompted APS action. We state again, that EIC's editorial procedures were the basis for the actions. Subject matter and relevant articles was not. No, that becomes relevant, actually. What are they guilty of? APS is not a court, but Fiedler, APS members, and indeed the entire field of scientific psychology, one can publish in POPs without being a member of APS, and the wider public deserve an answer to this question. Yeah, I would like to know. APS email continues. Before any action was taken, the editor-in-chief, Fiedler, was contacted regarding the complaints and provided with a list of questions regarding his editorial actions. His response did not dispute the factual basis of any of the details included in his complaint. This actually is a contradiction. Here is what Lee is pointing out. This appears to conflict with what Fiedler wrote here, which I believe, yes, setting the record straight. I think I have that one open. Yes, I have that one open already. We'll get to that in a second. what Fiedler wrote here, the second equally important reason was that APS, the organization who holds the Pop's journal, never asked me for my version, never engaged on what seemed to be a self-evident rule of procedural justice, namely to give the target of accusation a chance to reply and provide a counter-statement to be circulated in the same widespread channel as the accusations. Up to now, nobody asked for my version. The apparent contradiction is that whereas Fiedler says he was not asked for his version of events, APS says they did contact him. However, this contradiction is more apparent than real. Fiedler's email above resolves the apparent contradiction as follows. Whereas it is literally true that the EIC Fiedler was contacted as stated by APS, it is also literally true that he was given only the opportunity to respond to a series of narrowly tailored interrogation type questions about specific facts and was not asked for or to explain his actions, procedures, and policies. In short, APS failed to identify anything Fiedler did that deserve being ousted. So, here are things, based on the public discourse around this, things that he might be found guilty of. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not going to get into this. You guys can read it, but you got to get very specific with the accusations and violations, as Lee says. And of course, there's not a whole lot here to be able to work with in these things. So Klaus, of course, responded to all of this. As a personalized target of social media attack on Twitter, leading to a petition, I was accused as a racist as a journal editor of Pops who abuses his editorial power and who violated alleged journal rules and diversity norms. I was not only forced to resign as editor-in-chief, but also to tolerate insulting aggressions, threats to my scientific reputation, and my personal dignity. The first and foremost reason why I never provided a counterversion or rectifying statement is that the entire episode was so absurd and surreal. I therefore expected that, in spite of, or exactly because of the wisdom of the social media crowd, it could only take a moment to recognize that there's virtually nothing to justify the accusation that I am racist or that I have abused editorial power and ignored existing journal rules. The second equally important reason was that APS, the organization who holds the Pops Journal, never asked me for my version, never engaged on what seems to be a self-evident rule of procedural justice, namely to give the target of the accusation a chance to reply and provide a counterstatement to be circulated in the same widespread channel as the accusations. Up to now, nobody asked me for my version. The third reason was that, as a social psychologist, I did not want to play the role of a defendant, which presupposes that there are reasons to be defensive. Taking a defendant role might induce a hindsight effect that is a reconstructive memory illusion, driven by the outcome scenario in which I am the defendant. In contrast, my understanding was always that I am a victim, not the potential perpetrator in a malicious play. Fourth, I did assume and continue to assume that there are ethical reasons not to blatantly reveal confidential details about editorial processes. And there are. Peer reviewing and the entire editorial correspondence strikes me as a matter of trust and academic responsibility, preventing me from talking in public about my editorial strategy and my correspondence with other reviewers. In this particular case, though, after the entire editorial correspondence was publicized anyway, confidentiality constraints no longer prevent me from the following clarifying comments. But there is a lot here. So this is the things about this. So again, that is brief of a recap as I can possibly imagine. It's been relatively quiet since then, since all of that has happened, but there is more, as it were. And actually, Klaus actually tried to get some clarification sent out representing his perspective to the APS, to the Association of Psychological Sciences members. And, and he writes actually that the letter is misleading. The letter from APS that's over here is misleading to him. So in here he's saying the statement we learned about additional questionable editorial decisions and practices at the journal under the previous editor-in-chief remains as vague and uninformative as all the former accusations. To interpret the validity of this message, it would be necessary to know a whole bunch of things. Another paragraph is highly misleading. Before any action was taken, the EIC was contacted regarding the complaints and provided with a list of questions regarding his editorial actions. His response did not dispute the factual basis of any details included in the complaint. This sounds like the EIC was given a chance to provide its counterversion of the entire episode by established procedural justice rules. This criterion of fair treatment was never met because APS selected the list of interrogation-type questions provided. They did not constitute the EIC's perspective. Many reverse questions raised by the EIC remained unanswered, despite his explicit request. The EIC was given less than 24 hours to resign, much too fast to allow for the fair discussion of divergent perspectives. This EIC was not offered the same widespread email distribution list to present his counter-arguments to the same broad audience to which APS has already sent out its accusations. His remarks have gone unnoticed. APS had already admitted the journal's mistake and created social realities before the EIC could respond. Finally, Robert Gropp writes, the board reviewed the EIC's actions and concluded that the EIC demonstrated poor editorial judgment and bias, again without specification of what poor editorial judgment and bias was found, based on what criterion and diagnostic methods. To repeat, the negative evaluation is at variance with a plethora of positive feedback I received in countless emails. The discrepancy strikes me as conspicuous and calling for transparent cross-validation. So far, I have never received an evidence-based report of what exactly APS classified as poor editorial work, and the present email circular falls short of what it promises, namely further clarifications. I agree with that. I read the email in full before I started recording this, and it doesn't clarify anything at all. With best regards, Klaus Fiedler, former editor-in-chief. So, with all of the backstory out of the way, here, this is 2023. What happens in April 2024, finally, is this shows up on the journal's on the journal page itself. Collection of articles related to the December 2022 APS vote of no confidence in the editor-in-chief of Perspectives on Psychological Science. Now, I will say, of course, you had a whole bunch of editors resign. They all resigned after Klaus was shown the door within 24 hours. That is no way to handle due process. I'm sorry. There's no way to handle due process. And I've said from the beginning that I thought some of the things that Klaus did to handle it were, not kosher, but not necessarily something he should have been fired for at the same time. Not entirely kosher, but not as horrendously awful as what have you. And it's interesting. So they decided, for whatever reason, to go ahead and publish all of the articles associated with it. And as always, this stuff will be linked in the description for you. And it's very strange. I didn't think all of the articles would be published. And they also started with this particular long opening thing here. Well, not super long, but this particular thing, editorial, where they discuss again and attempt to include some things about, what they were concerned about and attempting more clarification, which, frankly, I don't think actually makes any good justification for anything based on what I read in here. In December 2022, the board of directors of the Association for Psychological Science became aware of specific concerns about the editorial practices of Klaus Fiedler, then the editor-in-chief of the APS journal Perspectives on Psychological Science. These concerns were not reported directly to APS, rather a manuscript detailing these issues was publicly disseminated by its author, Stephen O. Roberts, including correspondence with the editor. The concerns that were voiced indicated that the EIC had engaged in processes and actions that deviated substantially from editorial best practices in the handling of a series of papers. APS investigated the claims of inappropriate editorial practices. You did that over a weekend, and you gave him an ultimatum to resign in 24 hours, and you gave him tailored questions that he had to answer. He didn't get the chance to present his side of the story at all and defend himself. At least that's the way I read this, with everything that I found so far. The board of directors found that there had been significant problems with the editorial practices related to a series of articles by Hummel, Stanovich, Strobe, Jessom, and Roberts that the EIC envisioned as a discussion forum on diversity. The board of directors in December 2022 unanimously voted no confidence in the EIC. Following the vote, Fiedler resigned. Well, contrasting story of events right there is that Fiedler was told, you get out or we're going to fire you. Effectively, there may have been the vote of no confidence in there, but anyway. APS found that problems it identified with editorial practices were a cause for concern about the editorial quality of perspectives on psychological science. Problematic EIC actions included the following: accepting an article that criticized an original article on the basis of 3 reviews that were also critical of the original article. Further, relying on reviewers who did not reflect the representative range of views on the topic of the original article. Now, I've read all 3, and yes, they did all come at it from a particular perspective, and at the same time, they didn't all share exactly the same perspective. So, fine. You could perhaps argue maybe you should have gone for another reviewer that was more in Robert's corner. Right, whatever. Inviting the 3 reviewers who submitted the critique to submit commentaries on the critique. Well, if the goal was, here's my question about how the heck did this unfold? When did the idea come into play to turn this into a diversity forum? Because if it was just, article, critique, reviews, all those other kinds of things. Well, there had to have been a decision in there of, oh, hey, this might be really interesting to have as a diversity forum. Maybe we should invite all these other people who had all of these ideas and thoughts to submit also. In which case, no, it's not necessarily a bad thing. If that was the goal, that's not necessarily a bad thing or a bad practice. Could have argued, you should have gone for other wider range of critiques too. Fine. Could argue that. Accepting those commentaries without submitting them to peer review. I hate to break it to you, but that happens. That is not unheard of. You get desk rejections and you get immediate acceptances of certain things with critique commentaries. Commentaries are not necessarily subject to the same level of super high scrutiny that a peer-reviewed article is. Peer-reviewed research article is, where you actually have research analyses and what have you. But a commentary doesn't necessarily get subject to that same level of critique. And that's not just this journal. That's a lot of journals that don't necessarily do that. You also get immediate desk rejections without sending them out for peer review. Should we be saying now that all articles have to go out for peer review and there can be no desk rejections or desk acceptance, as it were? The editor does have a wide latitude with that, and it's not just at this journal. It is at all different journals. After informing the author of the original article that his invited reply would not be sent out for peer review, the EIC sent that reply to the author of the critical article to solicit further comments, and the EIC expressed no appreciation that the decisions and actions in the situation were questionable, violated editorial standards of practice, or were wrong. Here's the thing. Previous thing here, let me go back to this. Before any action was taken, the EIC was contacted regarding the complaints and provided with a list of questions regarding his editorial actions. His response did not dispute the factual basis of any details included in the complaints. How could he very well dispute them if you were just giving him a tailored list of questions to answer? How could he very well dispute them? How could he challenge that? How could he present any case to defend himself? You didn't give him an opportunity to do that. And it's obviously from Klaus's things that I don't think he regrets any of it, but what? You didn't really even give him a chance to defend himself. Didn't even give him a chance for back and forth. It was like 24 hours and it was done. No, so I don't buy this explanation that you're saying that the EIC expressed no appreciation that the decisions were questionable. I don't believe it in the slightest, reading this, given the timeline of events where there was like maybe a weekend to review things, and you gave him 24 hours notice that he was going to be either fired or he would either have to be resigned or he was going to be fired. You didn't give him any opportunity to really defend himself aside from answering a specific list of tailored questions, which, by the way, I would love to see what those questions were. That's the thing. Hey, there you go. There's been questions about the transparency of this journal, and I think justifiably so at this point. Put the damn questions that you asked him online. Put the questions that you asked him online. Somebody put the questions that he was asked online. I would love to see it. And I think in the interest of full transparency, because this journal's suffering from a crap ton of problems right now, it would do you well to do that. Following the resignation of the EIC, the board of directors established a committee to evaluate the journal, suspended acceptance of new manuscripts, formed an interim editorial panel to review and handle manuscripts that were under review when the EIC resigned. You realize the reason they had to form that was because you forced him out so fast that the other editors on his board were pissed. I read that. I read that article. I mean, where is it? Oh gosh. Fiedler on the roof. Which one is it? There's so many. Yeah. Letter protesting treatment of Klaus Fiedler. Fiedler's actions. Okay. Not justified. Even more worrying is that hundreds of our colleagues signed a petition for Fiedler's dismissal without having the benefit of hearing his explanation. We should all be profoundly concerned. There were a number of these folks who are themselves members of APS, and so many members of the editorial board just completely jumped ship on this. So that's just a point I wanted to make on that front. So you guys had to do an interim editorial panel, because you lost so many people because you forced the guy out without actually giving him a decent chance to defend himself. I'm sorry, that's what it looks like to me evidence-wise, and I gotta say that's not good accountability as far as the journal is concerned, and it's not actually an interest in the truth, which, again, if you're publishing science, I'm sorry, you're supposed to be after what the truth is, yeah? Assessed our policies and processes for receiving reports of editorial misconduct, recommended that experts in editorial and open science best practices resolve what to do with specific articles associated with the inappropriate editorial practices. You still haven't... This is not really clarifying anything of what was inappropriate. I'm sorry, it really wasn't. I said, yeah, sure, you could have gone with more critiques. I'm sorry, this happens on a regular basis? That kind of thing? Let's see. Review committee remains valuable to the field. Committee proposed that rather than a traditional call for editor nominations, APS should request proposals in which interested individuals would propose an editorial structure that would allow the journal to achieve its goals while maintaining scientific integrity. Interim editorial panel, review of practices. So, finally, for the most complicated matter, what to do with the articles that gave rise to the vote of no confidence in the EIC with no due process or actual procedural due process involved with this. I can't see it from what I found. There needs to be more transparency in this. I should like to see all of it, to be honest. I'm open to being wrong. About it, but there needs to be a crap ton more transparency, because there's really not. Even with all of this, there's really not all that much transparency. What was the extent of the contact and the interaction? How was he allowed to defend himself? Where was it? Show me, because I don't see it. This is not easy to resolve, given that several APS core principles are in conflict. First, APS is committed to editorial independence. Other things being equal, our journal editors should be able to decide autonomously which papers to accept. At the same time, we are committed to editorial integrity and best practices, as evidenced by our vote of no confidence in the EIC. A very rushed vote of no confidence, I would say. We also hold that, unless otherwise noted at the start of a review process, editorial correspondence should remain confidential. At the same time, we are committed to open, transparent processes, both in the editorial realm and the actions of the board. I'm doubtful of that from just reading this, from reading that letter. There's so many conflicting things going on with this that I'm doubtful of transparency in very much so with this journal. One approach would have been to rescind the acceptance of the articles by Hommel, Stanovich, Strobe, and Jussum, and to not publish the reply manuscript from Roberts, which had not been accepted for publication. This would have been the easiest decision because the articles in question were accepted for publication outside of the appropriate editorial standards and practices. However, this would also mean that the APS members would not be able to access the full scope of the content in order to make their own informed assessment, violating our goal of promoting transparency. Alternatively, publishing the full set of articles, including the editorial correspondence that highlights the inappropriate editorial practices, would enable more transparency but might violate confidentiality or inaccurately suggest that we endorse the problematic product of a bad editorial process. A third option was to ask Roberts to remove editorial correspondence from his manuscript and then publish all of the articles with this accompanying editorial. In 2023, Wagenmakers and Simon Varzi were asked to consider options for, Vizier, I think is the name, I butchered that, were asked to consider options for the disposition of articles. Based on the recommendation, the board of directors decided the best course of action was to ensure maximum transparency was to publish the unrevised articles, including Roberts' reply. The approach would require that several actors grant permission, to include email correspondence as personal communications in the Roberts article. Unfortunately, this permission was not granted, which meant that Roberts' reply could not be published as APS initially intended. As a last resort, in February of 2024, APS contacted Roberts to ask if he was able to rework his manuscript to remove the personal communication. Roberts promptly agreed and provided the version of the manuscript that is now included in this special issue. It should be clear from reading these papers that the comments on diversity that the ESC had accepted for publication do not represent the range of scholarly knowledge or opinion. Moreover, comments by Stanovich, Strobe, and Justin were accepted without peer review and were solicited at minimum, an uncommon and generally not accepted editorial practice. Desk acceptance and desk rejection do happen at a lot of journals. That is not uncommon. Less common, yes, but it's not like it doesn't happen at this journal or any other. Furthermore, it is bad editorial practice to organize a discussion that does not reflect the qualified scientific range of knowledge on a given topic. It was also a poor decision to identify the Hamel reply to the Roberts paper as the target paper for comments in this ill-conceived discussion, when the target article was actually the Roberts paper upon which Hamel was initially commenting. The structure effectively weighted arguments against Roberts and created the unfair and inaccurate impression that Roberts' work is something of an outlier. The editorial practices of the former EIC are unacceptable in any case. There's actually a lot of it that didn't warrant his dismissal, and you didn't give him any time to defend himself. So I'm sorry, you guys failed in your transparency too to begin with. And I'm an outside viewer looking at this. I'm an outside viewer looking at this, and I think you failed spectacularly in the transparency thing here. So I would have this is not a journal that I would submit to myself, but if it were me, I wouldn't submit anything to this journal ever again because of the way, and probably to a lot of APS journals, just because of the way this has been handled by the APS. But they are particularly troubling in the context of a scientific discussion about the role of institutional racism in psychology. We hope that publishing the full set of articles will provide a basis for productive discussions of these important issues as well as of editorial best practices. This has been a unique situation, to be clear. APS doesn't condone the public release of confidential communications without the explicit consent of all parties involved. For professional correspondence between editors, reviewers, and authors, the extent to which this should be considered personal correspondence is not entirely clear. A good guideline for all parties involved is maybe to communicate in the expectation that the correspondence, for one reason or another, might at some point in the future might become public. That doesn't make any sense. I didn't read that right. APS acknowledges this has been a long and complex process, and the ultimate solution may frustrate or disappoint some. You think? This isn't transparent. This isn't transparent at all. You didn't include anything about the whole time series events. There's nothing about the questions that were asked of him. There's nothing about why you only give him like 24 hours to be able to respond. Maybe a weekend tops. How do you prepare a defense in that amount of time? APS appreciates your continued patience while we complete the process of identifying and putting into place a new editorial team and editorial practices for perspectives on psychological sciences. I'm not that I would ever be there on that editorial board, but I wouldn't accept an offer to be on that editorial board, to be honest, after this mess. I would not. So that's the update on on the whole Fiedler on the roof fiasco, which continues to be a fiasco, as it were. And what a dumpster fire. But I'll summarize with this. I maintain that what Klaus did, in my opinion, was not the absolute best editorial practices. Was it worth anything worth firing him over? No, it was not at that point. Commentaries are accepted with desk acceptance. It's happened many, many times. It's also been desk rejected. Actually, a colleague of mine just had that happen recently. Commentary was just desk rejected. And so that does happen. The fact that he desk accepted a bunch of articles doesn't necessarily make it an unethical thing. So there's actually not very much clarity that's provided by that editorial. Now, feel free. You can always disagree, but do so respectfully. Yeah. And I find it fascinating that there's no discussion in here, because it would actually do APS well from their perspective to discuss in full the timeline, not just in this short, bloody piece that they put at the beginning, trying to explain, in which they don't really explain at all, I don't think. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, what they've explained here. That this is why we decided to fire him. Because that's effectively what it was, in this case, right? So, I mean, the summary that I can best give for this whole thing is it's a shit show. It's a shit show of how not to run a journal. And I'm sure this is going to be quite damaging for the reputation of the journal for a long time to come, just because of this whole mess. But such is the case. I will just point out that, of course, Lee has commented on the whole thing with this here. Yeah, I agree with Lee that one of the papers was Robert's paper, which was a very, very, very different perspective. One could argue, get a couple more that are in Robert's kind of camp with it. But, one could argue that, but that's not a huge deal. And Lee, of course, I think had a different, I can't resist quoting my denounced article written in summer of 2022, long before consideration, all that kind of thing here. So, again, there's a lot going on, so I'd consider going and looking at all of this yourself and going in there, because there's a lot to it. I understand others may have different interpretations, but my kind of whole summary of this thing is it's a shit show. It's an absolute shit show. And I think Klaus had some things at fault, yes, but I also think the journal did a crap ton of things wrong in responding to it. APS did a crap ton of things wrong in responding to it, and I don't see as much transparency as they claim in here. So that's it. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way at the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious.